a dynasty that ruled vast empires, their powers stretching across continents. They were the Habsburgs, a name synonymous with prestige, wealth, and unmatched influence. But beneath the glittering crowns and grand palaces, a darker story unfolded, a story of bodies breaking down, minds unraveling, and generations struggling against unseen forces. For centuries, this mighty family was afflicted by a series of baffling medical conditions, illnesses that defied the understanding of their era's greatest minds. These weren't just common ailments, they were strange, persistent struggles that shaped their lives, their reigns, and ultimately, their destiny. Number 1. The jaw. The portraits of the Habsburgs tell a curious tale. Across generations, from Emperor Maximilian I in the late 15th century to King Charles II, a distinctive facial feature became almost a family crest. It was a jutting lower jaw, often accompanied by a thick lower lip, a feature so pronounced it earned its own nickname, the Habsburg jaw. It was a physical marker, a silent testament to their long lineage, but for those who bore it, it was often more than just a peculiar look. Take Charles II of Spain, for instance, a monarch born in 1661. His jaw was perhaps the most exaggerated example in the entire dynasty. Descriptions from the court painters and foreign ambassadors leave little to the imagination. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth did not meet, making it difficult for him to chew food properly. Contemporary accounts describe how his tongue was often so large it barely fit in his mouth, sometimes causing him to drool. His speech, as a result, was said to be slurred and almost incomprehensible to those not accustomed to his manner of speaking. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental challenge to basic human functions. Even as a young child, the signs were apparent. Royal physicians and nurses surely noticed the unusual formation of his mouth. As he grew, the feature became more pronounced, a constant visual reminder of his family's enduring characteristic. When he sat for his many portraits, artists were compelled to capture this distinctive trait, making it an iconic part of his public image. These paintings today offer a stark visual record of the degree of his affliction. His mouth often appears open in these artworks, a depiction that likely reflected the difficulty he had keeping it closed due to the prominence of his jaw and the size of his tongue. The Habsburg jaw was not unique to Charles II. It was a recurring feature that appeared again and again within the family tree, sometimes more subtly, sometimes strikingly obvious. Emperor Charles V, Charles II's great-great-grandfather, was another famous bearer of the trait. Born in 1500, he too possessed a notable jaw. His personal physician, Vesalius, a renowned anatomist, reportedly noted Charles V's jaw in his writings, though he did not label it with a specific medical term. Instead, he simply described the physical reality that was present. Charles V's jaw was often depicted in his portraits, giving him a regal, if somewhat imposing appearance. Unlike Charles II, Charles V was a robust and active ruler for most of his life. But even for him, it presented certain challenges. Historians suggest that his ability to speak clearly in public addresses might have been affected, requiring him to exert more effort than others. The visual evidence of the Habsburg jaw is compelling across generations. Archduke Leopold V of Austria, who lived in the early 17th century, was another prominent example. His portraits show a remarkably similar facial structure to that of his later Spanish relatives. His lower jaw pushed forward, and his lower lip was often depicted as thick and pendulous. This consistency across different branches of the family, separated by time and geography but united by blood, certainly mystified observers who did not possess the understanding of genetics that would come centuries later. For many within the family, the jaw was simply a part of who they were, a family characteristic like hair color or eye shape. But the degree to which it manner aesthetic peculiarity. For others like Charles II, it became a significant disability. It affected his ability to communicate effectively, to nourish himself properly, and surely impacted his overall health and well-being. The sheer physical effort required for him to simply eat a meal or utter a sentence was immense. Royal banquets, which were often elaborate affairs, must have presented unique challenges for him. He would have needed assistance or special preparations to manage his food. His attendants would have been acutely aware of his struggles, assisting him with even the most basic actions. The social and political ramifications of such a visible physical trait were also present. In an era where physical perfection was often equated with divine favor and fitness to rule, the Habsburg jaw could be a source of private concern or even public commentary. While the dynasty's power was undeniable, the physical manifestation of this family trait became an object of fascination and, at times, thinly veiled. Critique from rivals or foreign courts. Diplomats, exchanging letters, often remarked on the distinctive features of the Habsburg monarchs they encountered, sometimes with sympathy, other times with thinly veiled derision. These private observations, now historical documents, offer a glimpse into how the physical appearance of the Habsburgs, particularly their unique jawline, was perceived on the international stage. The Habsburg jaw was a consistent thread running through the family's tapestry, a physical hallmark that spanned centuries and branches of the dynasty. It appeared on the faces of emperors and empresses, kings and queens, archdukes and duchesses. Each time it manifested, it was a silent record of the interconnectedness of their lineage. For some, it was a defining characteristic that contributed to their unique appearance in art and history. For others, particularly the most severely affected like Charles II, it was a profound physical burden shaping their daily lives, their interactions, and even indirectly, the course of their reigns. The visible evidence of this condition, meticulously captured by artists of the era, remains a striking testament to the enduring physical legacy of the Habsburgs. It stands as a silent witness to a medical peculiarity that continued generation after generation to define the very faces of Europe's most powerful ruling family. Number 2, the struggle for heirs. The quest for a healthy, surviving heir was a constant, often desperate preoccupation for the Habsburg dynasty. More than simply having children, the family faced a recurring and baffling challenge: a tragically high rate of childhood mortality, coupled with frequent miscarriages and instances of infanticide. Despite their vast wealth, their access to the finest physicians in Europe, and their unwavering devotion, the cradle of the Habsburgs often held sorrow. Consider the life of Isabella of Portugal, the beloved wife of Emperor Charles V, born in 1503. Their marriage in 1526 was a union of immense political importance, and the expectation for heirs was immediate and immense. Isabella quickly conceived, giving birth to their first child, Philip. In 1527, Philip, the future king, would survive to adulthood, but the path that followed was fraught with heartbreak. In 1528, Isabella delivered another child, Maria, who also lived. Then in 1529 she had a stillbirth, a devastating loss for any family, but especially for a royal couple desperate to secure the succession. Records from the court indicate the profound grief that gripped the emperor and empress. The struggle continued. In 1535, Isabella gave birth to Ferdinand, who died within a year. The court records simply note the death of the infant, often attributing it to a fever or other common childhood ailment of the time. In 1537, another son, Juan, was born, but lived only a few months. Each loss compounded the anguish and raised questions about the dynasty's ability to produce robust heirs. The cycle of hope and despair was relentless. The births were celebrated with great fanfare, but the subsequent deaths were met with periods of court mourning and solemn religious ceremonies, reflecting the deep sorrow and the political implications of each lost life. Isabella herself would tragically die in 1539 after giving birth to a stillborn child. Her passing at the age of 35, following years of repeated pregnancies and losses, was a profound blow to Charles V and the empire. Her physicians could offer little explanation, beyond general terms, for the repeated failures to bring viable children to term or ensure their survival beyond infancy. The grief of the emperor was immense, leading him to withdraw from public life for a period cloistered in a monastery. The consistent pattern of loss, birth after birth, stillbirth after stillbirth, infant death after infant death, was a grim reality for many royal families of the era, but it seemed particularly pronounced and persistent within the Habsburg line. Moving forward in time, the story of Maria Anna of Spain, born in 1606, who became the wife of Emperor Ferdinand III, tells a similar tale of reproductive struggle. Their marriage in 1631 was part of the intricate web of Habsburg alliances. Maria Anna was known for her piety and gentle nature. She bore Ferdinand 6 children who survived infancy, which might seem like a success story. However, she also experienced numerous miscarriages and stillbirths throughout her marriage. Historical documents, including correspondence between various European courts, frequently mention the pregnancies of the empress, and just as often the unfortunate outcomes. For example, her first child, Ferdinand IV, was born in 1633 and survived. Her second, Maria, born in 1635, died in 1636. Just a year later, another daughter, Mariana, born in 1636, lived. Then came several years of unfulfilled pregnancy. Court chroniclers often recorded the empress's delicate health during these periods, a common euphemism for the difficult and often dangerous experience of repeated pregnancies. The strain on Maria Anna's body and spirit must have been immense, given the relentless pressure to produce a robust line of succession for the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. Each pregnancy was a gamble, each birth a moment of both intense hope and profound dread. The final and perhaps most devastating illustration of this recurring issue comes from the Spanish Habsburg line, culminating with the last of their kings, Charles II. His parents, King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Their union, meant to strengthen the bloodline, seemed instead to contribute to its weakening. Philip IV had already been married before and had several children who died young. When he married Mariana, the pressure for a male heir was immense. Mariana had 5 children who survived beyond infancy, but she experienced numerous miscarriages and stillbirths, a pattern painfully reminiscent of Isabella of Portugal's life. Her first child, a daughter Margarita Teresa, born in 1651, lived, but her second, a son named Maria Ambrosio, born in 1655, died within weeks. Then came Philip Prospero, born in 1657, a boy who was celebrated as the longed-for male heir. But even he was frail. Court records describe his constant ailments, his fevers, his listlessness. His short life was a battle against sickness. He tragically died in 1661, just before his 4th birthday. The despair at court must have been palpable. The portraits of Philip Prospero, particularly the famous one by Velázquez, show a child with a pale face, a solemn expression, and a noticeable fragility, almost as if the artist was capturing the precariousness of his existence. The loss of Philip Prospero left Philip IV and Mariana in a desperate situation. Mariana became pregnant again, and in November 1661, Charles II was born. He was the only male child of Philip IV's second marriage to survive infancy, a testament to the sheer, unyielding nature of the reproductive struggles that plagued the dynasty. Charles II's own life, as will be discussed further, was a long battle with physical frailty from birth. The constant cycle of pregnancy, miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths cast a long shadow over the Habsburg courts. Queens endured immense physical and emotional strain. Their lives often defined by their ability to bear healthy children. The loss of a child was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic crisis. Physicians of the era, operating with limited understanding of human biology, could offer only prayers, herbal remedies, or bloodletting in the face of these recurring misfortunes. They observed the frailness of the infants, the fevers, the convulsions, the sudden wasting away, but the underlying causes remained a baffling mystery. The relentless pursuit of a strong succession line often led to marriages within the family, a practice common among European royalty. However, within the Habsburgs, this practice was particularly extensive. The pattern of unions between cousins and even uncle and niece was remarkably frequent. This was not viewed as unusual or problematic by contemporaries, but rather as a way to consolidate power and keep the royal blood pure. Yet the ongoing tragedy of the nursery, the repeated losses of infants and young children, the struggles of queens to carry pregnancies to term, and the difficulty in securing a robust line of succession remained a persistent, baffling, and heartbreaking reality for the mighty Habsburg family. Number 3. The shadowed mind. Beyond the physical ailments that afflicted the Habsburgs, a recurring and often deeply disturbing pattern of mental and emotional struggles manifested within the family. What contemporaries simply called melancholy or madness was a severe and isolating experience for those who lived through it, often leading to reclusive lives. Periods of profound sadness or erratic behavior that baffled and sometimes terrified their courts. These were not fleeting moments of sadness. They were persistent, debilitating conditions that affected their ability to govern, to interact, and to simply exist. Perhaps the most famous example of this shadowed mind is Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of the formidable Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, and thus a key figure in the early Habsburg story through her marriage to Philip the Handsome. From an early age, Joanna was described as highly intelligent, fluent in several languages, and deeply pious. However, even in her youth, there were hints of an intense, passionate, and perhaps overly sensitive nature. Her love for her husband Philip was described as obsessive and jealous even before their marriage in 1496. The true depths of Joanna's despair became terrifyingly apparent after Philip's death in 1506. His sudden passing plunged her into an inconsolable grief that transcended ordinary mourning. She refused to allow his body to be buried for months, insisting on keeping the coffin with her, traveling across Castile with it, often opening it to look upon his remains. Chronicles from the time describe her waking up in the middle of the night, demanding to see her husband, no matter the weather or the hour. Her behavior was deeply unsettling to her entourage and to the Spanish nobility. She would allow no women to approach the coffin. Fearing they would dishonor Philip, she would sleep in the same room as the coffin, often with the lid open. This prolonged and highly unusual mourning period was not just a display of grief. It was accompanied by other behaviors that led to her eventual confinement. She showed little interest in governing, neglecting her duties as Queen of Castile. She would wander aimlessly, sometimes refusing to change her clothes, living in a state of disarray. Her children were often neglected, and her periods of lucidity were interspersed with episodes of extreme agitation, fits of rage or profound withdrawal. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, deemed her unfit to rule and kept her confined mostly in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas for over 4 decades until her death in 1555. During her long years of confinement, visitors and caretakers described her oscillating between periods of quiet despondency and outbursts of anger or irrational demands. She would often refuse to eat, or refuse to leave her rooms, or refuse to allow others to leave. Her appearance became disheveled. The reports from the convent describe a woman who lived in a state of profound mental distress, a shadow of the intelligent princess she once was. The exact nature of her affliction was baffling to her contemporaries, who attributed it to her excessive grief, or simply to madness. Another prominent Habsburg figure afflicted by a shadowed mind was Emperor Rudolf II, born in 1552, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire. From 1576 to 1612, Rudolf was a highly intellectual and cultured man, a great patron of the arts and sciences, accumulating vast collections of curiosities, scientific instruments, and artworks. He was deeply interested in alchemy, astrology, and arcane knowledge. However, his reign was increasingly marked by periods of profound melancholy and reclusiveness. From the late 1590s onwards, Rudolf's mental state began to noticeably deteriorate. He became increasingly withdrawn, refusing to meet with ambassadors, avoiding state affairs, and retreating into the solitude of his castle in Prague. His advisors and family members expressed mounting frustration at his inability to make decisions or engage with the pressing political and religious challenges of his empire. He would spend hours in his private laboratories engaging in alchemical experiments or in his immense art galleries, seemingly lost in his thoughts, neglecting the daily duties of his high office. His bouts of melancholy were severe. Chroniclers describe him as falling into deep depressions, refusing to speak, sometimes not even recognizing those around him. At other times he exhibited fits of temper, suspicion, and paranoia. He grew increasingly mistrustful of his family, his courtiers, and foreign powers. This paranoia often led him to dismiss competent advisors and rely instead on less capable but more compliant figures. He was obsessed with prophecies and astrological charts, believing they held the key to understanding his fate and the empire's future. Rudolf's reclusiveness and erratic behavior had serious consequences. For the Holy Roman Empire, the growing religious tensions between Protestants and Catholics, the ongoing war with the Ottoman Empire, and the rising ambitions of his own brother, Matthias, demanded a strong and decisive ruler. Instead, they had an emperor who retreated into his own world, surrounded by alchemists and artists unable to confront reality. Diplomatic reports from Prague often expressed exasperation with Rudolf's refusal to grant audiences or engage in political discourse. Letters from his family reveal their increasing alarm and desperation regarding his mental state. His family eventually concluded that he was no longer fit to rule. In a series of forced agreements, culminating in 1608 and 1611, his brothers stripped him of his powers and territories, transferring authority to Matthias. This power struggle was fraught with tension, and Rudolf's mental fragility certainly contributed to his inability to resist effectively. He died in 1612, a solitary and largely powerless figure, leaving behind a magnificent artistic legacy but an empire on the brink of profound conflict, partly due to his decades of mental incapacity. The struggles of Joanna and Rudolf represent two stark examples of how deeply the shadowed mind affected the Habsburg. Their conditions were not understood by the medical knowledge of their era. Physicians could only describe the symptoms: the profound sadness, the irrational behaviors, the withdrawal, the difficulty with executive function. They might suggest spiritual remedies, changes in diet, or simply confinement as the only available treatments. The experiences of Joanna and Rudolf were extreme, but historical accounts suggest that less severe forms of melancholy or periods of emotional fragility were not uncommon among other members of the extensive Habsburg family, adding another layer of silent suffering beneath the veneer of imperial power. Number 4. The crippling pains. For centuries, many male members of the Habsburg dynasty were afflicted by a recurring, excruciating torment that often left them incapacitated. These conditions, known at the time simply as stone disease or the rich man's disease, brought agony that defied the understanding and treatment of their era's physicians, shaping the lives and reigns of some of the most powerful men in Europe. No Habsburg suffered more famously from these crippling pains than Emperor Charles V. Born in 1500, his early life was active and vigorous. He was a keen hunter, a skilled horseman, and a tireless traveler, constantly moving across his vast empire from Spain to the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. But in his late 20s, the first telltale signs of what would become a lifelong torment began to appear. His feet and hands would swell, accompanied by an agonizing, burning pain. These attacks were described as sudden and intensely painful, often striking without warning. Court chroniclers and diplomatic correspondents of the time frequently detail the emperor's suffering. Records indicate that by his 30s, Charles V was regularly experiencing attacks of gout. His joints, particularly in his feet and hands, would become inflamed, red, and exquisitely tender, making movement incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible. He would be confined to his chambers for days, even weeks. Unable to walk, to write, or to attend to the pressing matters of state, he had to be carried in a litter or a special chair, unable to mount a horse or walk across a room. These attacks significantly impacted his ability to govern his immense empire. Imagine a ruler responsible for vast territories, engaged in constant warfare, diplomatic negotiations, and religious disputes, suddenly immobilized by pain. During crucial military campaigns, Charles V would sometimes be struck by an attack, forcing him to delegate command or endure the agony while attempting to maintain his presence. For example, during the Siege of Metz in 1552, a particularly harsh winter campaign, Charles V was reportedly so crippled by gout that he could barely move. His troops saw their emperor suffering a powerful image that surely affected morale. The emperor's diet and lifestyle, though not seen as a cause by contemporary physicians, were often described. He was known for his prodigious appetite, enjoying rich meats, heavy sauces, and sweet pastries. He also consumed significant quantities of wine and beer. While these habits were common among the elite of his time, they were sometimes noted by observers. Alongside his increasing physical infirmity, his physicians prescribed a variety of treatments, including bloodletting, purgatives, and various herbal concoctions, none of which offered lasting relief. The pain would eventually subside, only to return with relentless predictability. As Charles V aged, the frequency and severity of his gout attacks only increased by his 50s. He was rarely free from pain. His hands became gnarled and misshapen from repeated inflammation, a stark visual testament to his suffering. Walking became a painful shuffle, and standing for any length of time was an ordeal. This constant physical agony played a significant role in his unprecedented decision to abdicate from his multiple thrones in 1556, retiring to a monastery in Musti, Spain. His retirement was not one of peaceful contemplation. It was a continuation of his physical torment. Letters written by his attendants from Usted meticulously detail his daily struggles. He continued to suffer from severe gout, and he also developed kidney stones, another source of excruciating pain. Records from the monastery indicate the emperor's frequent cries of pain, his sleepless nights, and the desperation of his confessor and his personal physician, who could offer little comfort beyond palliative measures. The accounts describe him passing stones, an intensely painful experience, and suffering from fevers and other associated symptoms that frequently accompanied these episodes. His last years were dominated by a continuous battle against these internal afflictions, a stark contrast to the dynamic and powerful ruler he once was. He died in 1558, worn down by illness and continuous pain. His brother, Ferdinand I, who succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor, also experienced bouts of gout, though perhaps not with the same severity as Charles. Later, Emperor Leopold I, who reigned from 1658 to 1705, was another notable sufferer. Contemporary accounts describe Leopold as a rather frail and pious man, but also one who was afflicted by gout, particularly in his later years. His limping gait and obvious discomfort were observed by those at court. His physicians likewise tried various remedies, but the relief was often temporary. The pain of gout and kidney stones was a profound and constant presence for many Habsburg men. It was a pain that limited their mobility, interrupted their duties, and wore down their spirits. Unlike a sudden illness that might pass or prove fatal, these were chronic conditions that lingered for decades, flaring up with agonizing intensity. The knowledge of their suffering spread through the courts of Europe, becoming a recognized characteristic of the dynasty. Physicians, lacking the understanding of uric acid metabolism or the formation of kidney stones, could only describe the symptoms and offer traditional, often ineffective, treatments. The sight of these powerful rulers writhing in pain, their movements restricted, was a baffling and humbling spectacle for their subjects, highlighting the limits of power and wealth in the face of relentless, debilitating physical suffering. Number 5. The frail body. The final and perhaps most encompassing medical mystery that afflicted the Habsburgs was a pervasive, almost systemic, physical frailty that seemed to plague many members, particularly in the later generations of the Spanish line. This went beyond a single condition, manifesting as general weakness, developmental delays, and a constellation of other deformities and chronic ailments that severely limited their lives and even their reigns. It was a quiet erosion of vitality, a baffling lack of robustness that struck at the very core of their physical being. The ultimate and most tragic example of this pervasive frailty is King Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that he was unlike any other royal infant. Historical accounts describe him as being extremely small and sickly. A tiny, delicate baby, he was so weak that he was not expected to survive infancy. His wet nurses, who were often responsible for the primary care of royal infants, reported his constant fevers and poor appetite. His early years were a constant struggle against a barrage of childhood illnesses that most children would overcome, but which clung to Charles with alarming tenacity. His developmental milestones were painfully delayed, while most children begin to speak around the age of 1 and walk shortly thereafter. Charles II did not speak his first words until he was 4 years old. His speech, when it finally emerged, was reported to be slurred and difficult to understand, partly due to the severe protrusion of his lower jaw, a well-known Habsburg trait. He did not learn to walk until he was 8 years old. Even then, his gait was unsteady, and he often needed assistance to move about. Court records detail the constant attention he required, the endless concern of his mother, Mariana of Austria, and the numerous physicians who attended him day and night. As he grew, his physical limitations became even more pronounced. His body remained disproportionate and frail. Contemporaries described him as being short for his age, with a large head and a thin, weak frame. His legs were particularly thin, almost spindly, and often swollen. His face, dominated by the notorious Habsburg jaw, was often described as elongated and pale. He frequently suffered from digestive issues, bouts of diarrhea, and abdominal pains, which likely contributed to his overall weakness and inability to gain strength. These were chronic complaints that persisted throughout his life, never fully resolving. The impact of this pervasive frailty on his daily life was profound. He struggled with even the most basic physical activities. Meals were a challenge due to his jaw. Walking, writing, and even sitting upright for extended periods would have required immense effort. His appearance was often described as sickly and almost childlike, even as he reached adulthood. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Spanish court often remarked in their dispatches on the king's visibly poor health, his lack of energy, and his general air of weakness. These observations were not merely casual remarks, they were a significant concern for those assessing the stability and future of the Spanish monarchy. His chronic ill health also severely impacted his ability to govern. The king was frequently bedridden or confined to his chambers, unable to attend to state affairs. Decisions were often delayed or made by his mother and advisors. His physical weakness translated into a perceived political weakness, making Spain appear vulnerable on the European stage. The constant worry about his health and the succession consumed the court, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety. Physicians of the time, baffled by his array of symptoms, resorted to various desperate treatments. They prescribed purges, enemas, bloodletting, and countless herbal remedies, none of which had any lasting positive effect on his condition. They simply described a body that was failing, with no discernible cause. The extent of Charles II's suffering was extreme. Historical documents indicate he experienced frequent convulsions throughout his life, often accompanied by fevers. His overall constitution was so delicate that even minor ailments could become life-threatening. He lived with constant pain, chronic illness, and severe physical limitations from birth until his premature death at the age of 38 in 1700. His death without a direct heir plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict shaped in part by the lifelong frailty of its last Habsburg king. While Charles II is the most extreme case, other Habsburgs also exhibited signs of generalized frailty or unexplained physical ailments that defied simple categorization. Emperor Ferdinand I, Charles V's brother, though a vigorous adult, was described by some as having a delicate constitution in his youth. Emperor Leopold I, who ruled the Austrian Habsburg lands in the late 17th century, was also often described as small, frail, and prone to various illnesses throughout his life. He was not as profoundly afflicted as Charles II, but he lacked the robust health that characterized many other European monarchs of his time. The consistent appearance of this physical frailty, characterized by developmental delays, chronic weakness, and an unusual susceptibility to illness across generations, was a silent and baffling burden on the Habsburg dynasty. It manifested not as a single disease but as a general lack of resilience, a quiet decline in the very physical vigor required for survival, let alone for ruling vast empires. Physicians could describe the symptoms they saw: the convulsions, the stunted growth, the chronic digestive issues, the difficulty with basic movements, but the underlying reasons for this widespread debilities